Hey everybody, welcome back to another Nature's Always Right video. Today we are going to make soil blocks. So if you saw a previous video, I showed you how to make my soil block mix and the different things that I add to it. There it is. So we're going to be starting off from that video, so go check that one out if you haven't seen it. So we're starting out with the dry mix here, and now we're going to wet it. First off, what are soil blocks and why would you want to make these? So soil blocks are the healthiest way to start your seeds and create seedlings. And what you use is a blocker like this. You can get them from johnnyseeds.com or some other places. So what these are 2-inch blocks. And you can see it has a little dibble there to even make the seed hole for you, so it makes it very easy to plant. And what's so special about soil blocks is that they air prune. So here's a block right here. This is still baby, it still needs to develop more roots. But what air pruning is when the roots hit the side of the block here, they try to go out to keep growing, they can't. They hit air and they actually die. And what that does is it sends a response to the plant to create a lot more of these smaller capillary roots, and the roots will actually just kind of grow along the edges here and underneath. It creates a much stronger, healthier plant. Now when you've seen in a pot or in the plug trays, the roots will kind of spiralize and just keep going round and round and round. That isn't good. They're not creating as many roots. It's just a bunch of really long roots, and they're starting to change and get used to the pot that they're in. And we don't want that. The soil blocks create a much healthier plant, and it makes it very easy to transplant, and there's less transplant shock as well. So the next thing to consider with soil blocks is the tray that you're going to put them on. Because we want to have this air pruning effect, we need a tray that has kind of an open bottom. So these are the type of trays that you want to use. They're a mesh bottom, and they sell them in a 10-20 size as well. These flats will fit about 64 blocks, I believe. Now I do the soil blocks in 10-20 trays as well. This is not the optimum way to do this, but these are the trays that I had a lot of. They still will air prune decently, but they won't really air prune on the bottom. They'll kind of grow longer, more dangly roots, but they don't spiralize. Now these soil blockers come in different sizes as well. You can get a 20 blocker, and the 20 blockers come in 3/4 inch size blocks. Then you can size them up and put them into the 2-inch blocks. The 2-inch blocks you can put into the 4-inch blocks. For the whole time I've been farming, I've always used the 2-inch blocks because you can grow just about any plant in them. So here I've got squash, cucumber, basil, charred kale, there's tomatoes coming up there, lettuce, you can do anything. Now for the bigger things like cucumbers and squash, you're going to want to pot them up at a later point to get them bigger before you put them out into the field or your garden. You can also get a more large-scale version, which will do 16 blocks at a time, I believe. 16 of the 2-inch blocks. So you can do much more at a time. So depending on your scale, that will help you kind of decide what you'd like to do. So now let's talk about the soil mix here. This is the most important part. So as you saw in my previous video about how to make the mix, you know how to do that. So now we need to get it wet, and that's a really important part. So we need to get the right type of moisture. Now, when you're choosing your tote to do this in the beginning, when you're starting out, I recommend using a tote that has holes on the bottom so that if you add too much water, it'll drain that water out. And it will make it a little bit easier for you and less frustrating when you're starting out. Once you get the hang of the amount of moisture you need, then I just recommend using a tote with a solid bottom, and that's what I do, and you just get the right amount of moisture and start blocking. Now I'm just going to add water, of course. Another thing I like to do when I have it available is to add my worm and compost tea to this mix, and that way I'm inoculating it with a ton of beneficial microbes and fungi and a bunch of nutrients that I've added to that tea as well. So first I'm going to go grab some of my tea. Okay, so here's some of the tea. So I'll just add that in. And then what I'm going to do is mix this up, see what remaining moisture I need to add, and add that with the hose. Okay, so after adding that inoculant, I'm just going to mix this up and see where we're at with our moisture. that was a decent amount. That, you know, we're gonna get really close just with that. It's just really important to mix it a couple times as you go. You can really see what you're working with. So this is very close to what we want, actually. Now, one way I kind of test it is I'll compress. What I'm looking for is after I compress it, I should be able to kind of slap it and do this, and it should wiggle a little bit. Not totally like Jello, but have a little bit of that Jello-like effect. Especially when you're beginning, you should just test it, see how it works. So I'm just gonna try some blocks. Nice. These are actually really good. I'm just feeling the block, squishing it, making sure it maintains its shape. I should be able to kind of throw it on my hand. It shouldn't blow apart. This is actually good enough. I don't think I'm gonna add any more water to this. So all of the liquid was added with the tea. So with the vermiculite, I feel like it's a little easier to make the blocks than the perlite. Makes it a little trickier. This just holds together a bit better. It's softer and squishier. So since getting the moisture right is so important, and the other one kind of had that rare situation of it coming out perfect, I'm going to show you guys again with the moisture, just adding with the hose. And then I also want to explain the blocking technique to prevent the suctioning effect, and I'm going to give you some good techniques on punching in the blocks so that it comes out really perfect. So here we go. I'm going to add the water. So this is just a small batch, so it's not going to take an insane amount of water like a normal larger batch would. And soil can hold a lot of moisture, so you'll be really surprised when you're making these how much it can actually hold. So you just want to add some in and mix. So I'm going to show you what a too dry soil block looks like, and then I'm also going to show you what a soil block looks like when it's too wet. Okay, so this definitely needs more moisture. It can't hold together at all. But let's try to block this. And so it is able to form a block, right? Let's see if it stands up to our different tests. So if I throw it, oh, it just exploded. That is way too dry. So it just crumbles super easily. Okay, so we need more moisture. And I'd say we're about halfway there for the moisture, so we're going to be careful. Mix again. Oh, see how I missed the edge and there was all that dry stuff there? It's really important to make sure you're thoroughly mixing. So I'll compress it like I showed you before. There's no wiggle to this though, so I don't think that this is going to be ready. It's pretty close though. This is pretty good. Let's see if it stands up to the test. It's pretty good. You could block with this. It's slightly dry, I think, though. Little crumbly, not bad though. This is a, there's a little range of moisture, and this is pretty good. We see how I keep throwing it and it eventually breaks apart. This is still slightly too dry. So now we're going to be really careful, just add a little bit more water. Compress it, and now it's got that little bit of wiggle factor that I like. And this block seems really good. Let's test it. Okay. So the moisture before was good. I'd say this is better though. Okay, of course when you're throwing it, it's gonna break apart a little bit, but you see how it's trying to hold together? And watch if I squeeze this. I'm squeezing as hard as I can. That's how much moisture is coming out of it. And this, in my opinion, this is a perfect block. So now, what does it look like when you go too wet? So say I added a bunch more moisture and I kind of went a little overboard. So this has a lot more wiggle to it. So now it's harder for the mixture to kind of stay in the blocker. It almost crumbles apart more. It wants to fall apart more because it's so squishy. So if I throw this against my hand, it deforms way more. And if I squeeze this, tons of moisture. So this is too much. And a lot of times what'll end up happening, especially when you get to the bottom of your mix, it'll just be so difficult to get it in that you'll have to do it by hand like this, which is okay, but it's more effort and more work. So the better moisture that you get your mix, the easier it's going to be on you. If you do too much water, you can throw in some of your dry mix to help soak up some of the extra moisture, or throw in a little bit extra peat moss or something to help soak it up. Okay, so now let me just touch on the techniques for using the soil blocker. If you just put the blocker in and lift up, you'll notice that 3 of the blocks stayed behind because it creates a big suction effect. So to prevent that, we either need to roll forwards or backwards or side to side as we're blocking. So I typically will roll back to forward, just like that. And it's done. 3 or 4 punches in and you should be able to get a good block. You can also go side to side. That also works. I don't really like that as much. My favorite is to go back to forward. So rolling like this, forwards. For me, that's the easiest. So that's what I would recommend, rolling forward. And that's it. And then, as far as your technique goes, when you release the block, you're going to lift the soil blocker up and at the same time press down. So I'm grabbing this bar here and I'm squeezing. I like to squeeze it a bunch and that helps to kind of shoot it out. So I'll lift up and go and kind of lift and squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. As you're going with the blocks, sometimes you need to kind of push them a little bit so they sit in there tight so that you can fit an entire full row in there. You can see here at the end it gets pretty tight, and that's why I was saying it's kind of nice to keep pushing them forward a little bit. And there we go. Now this one got a little bit deformed. If you're worried about that, you could easily just kind of reform it. Just put a little bit more dirt in there, poke the hole, done. And it's really nice because it puts a little 1/4 inch dibble in there, perfect for any of your seeds. If you're planting something like squash seed or cucumbers, watermelon seed, what I do for the 2-inch block, I'll drop it in, and then before I cover the seeds up, I'll push it down deeper, another 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, so that it's deeper into the block, which is a lot better for bigger seeds. So I'll press down about 3 or 4 times with my rolling technique, and then that gets it so that it's, really flat. If you're not getting enough soil compacted in there, the blocks will end up a little bit short. And as you're blocking, pay attention to the height of your blocks, and if they're getting shorter, you want the biggest block possible so that they have as much root growing area as possible. So that time where I got stuck, I didn't squeeze the trigger well enough before I lifted up. So another technique that people will do, sometimes a bunch of dirt will get on the top of here. People will have another bucket of water that they'll just wash the soil blocker off in. I don't find that step to be necessary, but you may, so I just wanted to tell you about that. So now all we need to do is plant our seed and come back with either vermiculite or perlite to cover. I like vermiculite the best to cover with, or what I'll do is a 50-50 mixture, half peat moss, half perlite. I do that all the time, that works great. Or you could do a half peat moss, half vermiculite. And you should play around with them to see what you like best and the costs and everything. But for the cheapest way, and the way that I always do it, is I do half peat moss and half perlite. And that works out fantastic for me. But the best way, the ultimate way I would say, is probably the vermiculite. And having that vermiculite on top helps prevent some mold growth. Maybe you can see on my tray here, there's a little bit of green going on. If you just put the vermiculite on top or just the perlite on top, it'll help prevent that from happening because it allows more airflow and prevents the sun from hitting the soil, and that's what's growing that moss. So you'll notice on my blocks, some of them are different height. These lower ones here, I didn't do a good enough job compressing down and getting the maximum amount of height. Now it's okay, the seeds will still work out great, the plants will still work out great, but just want to emphasize that you're always trying to get the maximum height. Sometimes at the end, especially if you got it too wet, it gets a little tricky to completely fill these up. So a trick that you can do is just come in with your hand and just rub some in over the top there. You should do this over your tote. Okay, and that will make it a full block for you. Then on your 1020s, you're never going to be able to get it perfect. What I do is I just make another set of blocks to the side and then just set them in by hand. Done. Okay, so here's my mix of half perlite, half vermiculite. Okay, so it's really easy to cover. All you gotta do is put a light covering over the top. And then you can just smooth it out like this to cover the holes. And you're just doing a very small amount, just enough to cover the holes. And then I'll kind of just sweep it into one little area and get rid of it, get rid of the excess. And then the final step that I'll do is just a little bit of compression just to sink them in there and make a nice little seed bank for them. Make a nice little womb for them to germinate in. And that's it. All done. The final step, a really light watering. The soil blocks are already super wet, so you don't need to add much, just enough to get the top wet and to help sink in those seeds, get any air pockets out of there, and get them off to a really good start.